Hello, dear listeners, and thanks for tuning in to Master English with Tim, the podcast where Tim helps you master English in depth and detail and without ever hurrying. I'm Tim, native speaker English teacher from the United States, polyglot, podcaster, world traveler, and author of several dictionaries for learning English. In this week's episode, I'm going to talk about what it means to know a word. Knowing a word is something most of us just do without really thinking about it, but by listening to this episode, you will understand that knowing a word or expression is more than just knowing one pronunciation and its spelling and one or two meanings. And this episode will also help you to understand which words you need to learn more deeply so you can communicate better. Now, learning vocabulary is the biggest task that you have when learning a language. You need to know thousands of words and thousands of expressions that are made out of those words. So it's natural, I think, when people try to learn vocabulary quickly. They may not know exactly how many words and expressions they need to know, but on some level they know that they need to know thousands of them. So they forget about detail and focus on learning new words and expressions. And you know what? That's honestly not a terrible mistake. The reason it's not a terrible mistake is because knowing a word or expression isn't a yes or no, black or white, know it or don't know it situation. In fact, it's normal to partially learn a word, to learn just the most basic or important aspects of it, and then add detail and nuance to your understanding later. But if you want to really master English, the key is not to forget about adding those details, which is what I'm going to talk about in this episode. There are, in fact, 8 things that you need to know about each word if you want to say that you truly know it well. The first and most basic thing you need to know about a word or expression is its pronunciation. Okay, maybe that sounds obvious, but the reality is that because of regional variation, every word has more than one pronunciation. For example, you know that in the US we say tomato, and in Britain they say tomato. That same situation, where one word is pronounced differently in different regions or countries, is super common. But is it really that important? Well, I would say these regional differences aren't super important, especially if you usually communicate with people from just one region. But I would also say that knowing the Canadian and Southern US and New York and New Zealand pronunciations is useful. That's because when you learn these different pronunciations, it makes listening comprehension in general a lot easier. It helps you to be more relaxed because you've already heard different pronunciations of the same word and are prepared for variations of that word. Now, I said earlier that each word has more than one pronunciation, but the truth is that most words have many pronunciations. That is because of what I call chewing gum pronunciation, which is informal, real-world pronunciation, which is often very different from the pronunciation that you find written in dictionaries. For example, no one says temperature. In fact, they generally say temperature. So compare temperature, which is what you might find in a dictionary, especially older dictionaries, and what we in fact say is not temperature, but temperature. You don't even hear that second letter, the first letter R in the middle of the word, temperature. Now, people also rarely say the word probably the way it's written on the page. Instead, they say probably. And the pronunciation of one word is also changed by the words that are spoken before and after it. Let's take the past tense form of the verb send. The past tense form of send is sent. And if you put a word after that starts with the sound y, the pronunciation of sent becomes sench. For example, I sent you an email a second ago. Now, sometimes you'll hear people say, I sent you an email a second ago, but you'll also hear, I sent you. This phenomenon of words having real-world pronunciations that are radically different from the pronunciation written in dictionaries is not some minor or cute little detail. It is in fact the rule and not the exception, and it affects pretty much every single word in English. It really happens all the time. I already talked about the chewing gum pronunciation phenomenon in episodes 7 and 18, and if I had more time, I would make a whole podcast about just this phenomenon. That's how important chewing gum pronunciation is for listening comprehension. Okay, though, that's enough about chewing gum specifically and about pronunciation generally. Those are the most basic aspects of knowing a word, the pronunciation of it. Let's move on to another aspect of knowing a word well, the second one. That aspect is knowing a word's different forms. Most nouns, for instance, have a singular and a plural form, like one speech, many speeches. Now, uncountable nouns have only one form. Love, oxygen, importance. You don't have many loves. Well, I guess you could in one sense, but oxygens, no. You have some oxygen or a lot of oxygen or a little bit of oxygen. You don't have oxygens. There's no plural. Now, a few very commonly used nouns have irregular plural forms. Child, children. Sheep, sheep. Woman, women. Tooth, teeth. There are also lots more nouns that have irregular plurals, and especially for nouns that end in the letters US, there are different plural forms. So several different plural forms for a single word. For example, if you take a large group of native speakers and ask them what the plural of cactus is, some people will say that it's the same as the singular form, so one cactus, many cactus. Others will say, no, it's cactuses. One cactus, many cactuses. And then some others in the group will say, no, it's one cactus and many cacti. So which one should you use? Well, honestly, it doesn't matter that much which one you use, but it is kind of important for you to recognize and understand all of them because they're different enough from each other that, you need to be able to understand that they all come from the same singular form. Now, before we move on to the next topic, though, let's not forget about verb forms. You, of course, need to know the past forms of irregular verbs, and you also need to know how to pronounce the S form of verbs in the present simple. I talked about that several episodes ago. In fact, I talked about the S form of verbs and how to pronounce the S form back in episode 77 a few weeks ago. And the next thing, the fourth thing that you need to know about a word is its meaning. Surely that sounds really obvious, but there's one important thing to remember here, and one really important thing that almost everyone forgets. The thing that everyone forgets is that words have more than one meaning or function. For example, intelligence. Let's just take the word intelligence as an example. This is one of my favorite examples. So, intelligence, the most important meaning, the primary meaning is a person's ability to understand things. So, intelligence, though, is also a government organization whose job it is to secretly collect information about people in order to help the government make decisions. So, for example, the CIA in the United States, or the KGB in the Soviet Union, or the MI6 in Great Britain are all examples of intelligence agencies. Another meaning of intelligence is the information that is found or collected by organizations like MI6 or the CIA. So you can see that these meanings of intelligence are quite different from each other. This is a super common situation. Words in English normally have several different meanings, and if you know a word well, then you know the different meanings of that word instead of just one. I've talked about this actually several times in all of the episodes where I've talked about the NGSL. I've mentioned this fact or gone into it in detail actually. So the other aspect about knowing a word, the fifth one, the next one, is that you need to remember that is less important, but still important, is that words often have metaphorical meanings. For example, let's imagine that you work as an executive at a car rental company, and you're looking for secret, special information about a competing car rental company. You might call the information that you find intelligence. That, of course, does not mean that you think that you're a spy working for the MI6 like James Bond. It just means that you're talking about information that was collected maybe a bit secretly and that is special or important. You won't share this information. So again, that's a metaphorical meaning. Okay, let's move on to the sixth point. There's one last aspect of meaning that we need to deal with, and that aspect is connotation. A word's connotation is an idea or quality that a word makes you think of or an emotion that it makes you feel in addition to the word's meaning. For example, the word metropolis has positive connotations for most people. When they hear this word, they think of high-speed trains and airports and worldly, sophisticated people and big companies and a fast pace of life and drinking coffee and having interesting conversations and so on. All of those things, all of those associations are connotations of the word metropolis. Okay, now let's talk about the seventh aspect of knowing a word, which is really important if you want to be able to use the word fluently and easily. That aspect is collocations. A collocation is a combination of words that happens frequently. For example, I mentioned earlier the word intelligence with the meaning of information that's secretly collected by the government to help it make decisions. Some collocations of intelligence with that meaning are collect intelligence, gather intelligence, analyze intelligence, and faulty intelligence. Faulty intelligence is incorrect intelligence that kind of pushes you to make an incorrect decision. So, the more collocations that you know for each word, the better you will understand the word in context when you read or when you listen, and the easier it will be for you to use the word yourself. If you want to improve your knowledge of collocations, you can do something that's very easy. You can use ChatGPT or a similar program and ask ChatGPT to list the collocations of a word that you're studying. In fact, if you really want to learn the collocations of this or that word, then ask ChatGPT to put the most used or most common collocations at the beginning of the list and the less used or less common ones at the end. Also, ask ChatGPT to separate the non-transparent collocations and put them in a separate group. A non-transparent collocation is a collocation which has a meaning that is different than what the individual words suggest. For example, throw a party is a non-transparent collocation. You can understand throw and you can understand party, but knowing those two different words does not mean that you will understand the collocation throw a party. So again, throw a party, you understand one word, you understand the other word, but you don't necessarily understand the expression. That's a non-transparent collocation. So again, ask GPT to separate collocations into transparent and non-transparent, easy and difficult. That's four categories. Easy and transparent, easy and not transparent, difficult and non-transparent, easy and non-transparent. So, okay, now we are ready for our eighth and last aspect of each piece of vocabulary that you are learning. That aspect is register. A word's register is the time, place, or part of society where it is commonly used. Some examples of different registers are general, which means that a word is used by nearly everyone and over many different periods of time. Another register is conversational, which means that it's used mainly in informal spoken English. Another is written, used mainly in writing, and another is literary, used mainly in works of literature. Slang is also a register. We also have registers related to places. For example, British or Irish or Canadian or Texan or New York registers, and so on. There are also registers for professions like medical or IT or government or car mechanic. Register is important because you probably want to use words that people expect you to use. You don't want to use slang with your boss or literary words while watching a rugby match. If you're unsure about a word's register, you can easily find it in a dictionary. You will see your target words register in italics before the word's definition. You might see a word like medical or historical or youth or old-fashioned or Australian and so on, and that is the word's register. So, okay, that is everything for this week. I hope that I really deepened your perspective on learning English vocabulary and what it means to know a word or expression. Thanks for listening, and see you all next Monday.